The content of this podcast includes topics that may be difficult for some people to confront or discuss. These conversations can be triggering. If you are underage, please speak to your guardian before continuing. Welcome back to That's an Issue podcast. And this week, Dr. Tara, she's a psychologist, by the way, and Yoni, who's not a psychologist, he's actually a lawyer, sit down with Dr. Norman Blumenthal, who is the Director of Trauma, Bereavement and Crisis Intervention at OHEL. This actually is a very heavy topic, talking about loss and bereavement and death, but Dr. Norman Blumenthal is actually a very fun guy, and it's a very enjoyable conversation. It's a very serious topic, but we all had a fun time with it. And this is something that I know freaks me out, this idea that everyone dies, that it's just inevitable, but it's hard to make that connection with when it actually does, and also unfortunately when there's some traumatic death, untimely or seems untimely. How does one deal with that, and how does one go about that? This is a conversation that I wish this has always been around, and I'm sure it has, but maybe not at this scale. And they talked to Dr. Norman about the do's and don'ts when sitting with someone who lost a loved one. There's a lot of don'ts, and unfortunately, a lot of people make that mistake. And they go through it and just help give you a better sense of what actually happens, what our brain does, and what our emotion do, and just how to navigate it. So without further ado, Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Mental health, relationships, those are loaded topics and something that affects every part of our lives. But we aren't having enough open conversations about it.
And that's an issue.
Welcome, Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, thank you.
It's great to have you.
Before we jump in to our
Right.
topic tonight, which is your specialty, grief, bereavement, can you first tell us a little bit about what you do, like on a daily
Sure.
basis?
Sure. So actually, there was a point not so long ago when I had 4 jobs. And people used to ask me, how come you have 4 jobs? And I used to say 1 for each tuition. But I've gotten it
Cute.
down to 3. I work half-time for OHEL. I run their bereavement and trauma team. We have about 10 to 15 trained mental health professionals. I've basically trained them. And we do interventions when there's traumas, losses. Some of the more public ones, I think I just mentioned to you before that I was in Surfside twice. I was with my team the first time. We were in Pittsburgh after the shooting, Jersey City after the shooting. We were in Malibu after the fires. So we do some of that. And then, of course, on a more individual level, which I'm not at liberty to talk about, when there are tragedies and losses for families. I'm also an adjunct professor at Yeshiva University, both in the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, RITS, and Furkauf Graduate School in Psychology. I co-teach with David Pelkovitz a course called Pastoral Psychology, where we go through different issues in mental health relevant to the prospective rabbi educator. I also help in a contemporary issues course, and there's a joint program between RITS and Furkauf, where the students get a professional certificate in counseling, and I teach the bereavement course for that program, and then I have a private practice in Cedarhurst.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot. I don't know how you have time to come
Yeah,
here.
right, and there used to be a 4th job, but I'm cutting back.
Wow.
Okay, thank you for giving us, some of your very precious time.
Okay, right. I said it's my pleasure, and this is important, and I really support it.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so you just threw out a bunch of words: grief, bereavement, trauma. Could you start by just telling us, what are the differences between some of those concepts for people who aren't familiar?
Sure. Well, trauma is clearly let me put it this way. We go through life expecting life to be predictable, and we have to. If every moment we expected an earthquake, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Mm-hmm. So we rely on this predictability. And every once in a while, something happens that throws off that predictability. Sometimes life-threatening, but not only life-threatening. So again, if you go to work on a fall morning and then airplanes go crashing into your office building, that's trauma. But discovering a spouse who had an extramarital affair, finding out that a respectable member of your community is a criminal or molester or something like that, that's also trauma because we rely on others. And it's shocking when matters don't turn out the way we want. A child who finds out the parents are getting divorced, that's also a trauma of sorts. So that's the trauma piece. The other piece where probably even I've established myself as even more of my niche is bereavement, which is how do we respond to losses? And mostly we're not talking about the more predictable losses, the elderly grandparent, great-grandparent who dies, but those unexpected, sometimes called out-of-sequence losses. And how do we respond, and how does community and family members assist, and mental health professionals as well?
Okay, so not every loss would be considered a trauma, or?
Well, that's a very good question. That's a question I often get asked. Is there a difference between someone who dies, again, in a vehicular accident? I'm just going to say, just a quick aside, I'm sorry I talk so blandly about these horrible events. I often say this is why I don't get invited to parties, because people ask me what I do for a living and the party's over, you know. Wow. But it's the nature of my work. But is there a difference between someone, say, a sudden death, such as death from a vehicular accident, a fall, a suicide, a homicide, something of that sort, versus somebody who, after years of battling an illness, deteriorative disease, finally succumbs to the disease? And there are differences, but the similarities are greater than the differences. But the trauma component is probably greater in the sudden deaths. But any time you witness dying, there's a trauma piece to it. I watched my 91-year-old mother die and watched the monitor go flat. In some respects, I was relieved because she was suffering terribly. But on the other hand, it was traumatic to see that transition from this world to the next. So there is a trauma piece probably in all death. More typically, the trauma is more of the initial response. It's intense, painful. It tends to pass quickly. Sometimes it doesn't, but in most cases it passes more quickly. And then the grief sets in. And the grief is much slower, also painful, but much more lengthy and painful. Not more painful, but lengthy and painful, yeah.
Right. You want to ask a question, or should I keep going?
You're doing great.
Okay. My next question is about grief.
Yeah.
Is there a typical way people grieve? Is there a typical process or timeline?
This is a great question. So yes and no. There are patterns that we know, and we have a certain understanding of how come people grieve and what function grief serves, which is very important in terms of understanding how to provide comfort. But everybody's grief is unique. In Lamentations and Eicha, the prophet says, Hayesh machov k'machovi, is there a pain like my pain? And everybody's pain is unique. And it's sometimes a disservice to the person to speak in generalities. So it's a combination of recognizing certain patterns, the function of grief, and at the same time being respectful of everybody's own unique response. Okay. Just this week I did an intervention, and I was all prepared for a certain response, which I typically saw, and I got a radically different one. That's the nature of this work.
Right.
What does that look like? What are you anticipating versus what's radical?
Well, I'm not going to talk about this specific
Not specific
situation.
case, but what would you?
But sometimes people are not, at a certain stage, are not sad. They're furious. They're angry. They're confused. They're jealous. They're disoriented.
And that's unexpected? Or that's
some of those are expected, but at certain phases you don't expect it.
Right.
I've had situations, and again, I don't want to be specific, but I've had situations where a person or a family responded in a fashion that to me seems totally contraindicated. That is contrary to whatever I understand from research and from years of work. And instead of challenging it, I go along with them. What we call sometimes they feel I mirror them. I follow them along. Then I come to realize that in their situation, that was perfect. That was exactly what they should have done. So it's really very much respecting. I mean, that's true in therapy in general. And, I often tell the story. Is this okay if I?
Yeah. Oh, please.
My Ritalин's wearing off, so I'm going to be all over the place now. But when I was in YU, my Rebbe was Rav Aaron Kreiser, who was a very famous person, one of the people who brought European scholarship to this country. And most of my contemporaries at the time were going to law school and medical school. This is the 70s YU. And he was giving me some well-deserved rebuke at one point because I was a senior and I had 1.5 feet out the door. And he said to me, "And you're going to medical school, right?" And I said, "No." I said, "Law school?" I said, "No." So what are you doing? He said, "Psychology." He took me outside, and this stays with me till this day. It was over 40 years ago. And he put his finger in my face. He said, "Blumenthal, you want to be a psychologist, you got to be a gaon. You got to be a genius." So a doctor, a lung is a lung, but every patient who comes into his office is his own unique person. And he said, so study hard, listen to professors, and read the books, because it's a very hard profession. And every time I have a new patient or a new trauma case or a bereavement case, I see him in front of me, and I say, it doesn't matter how long you're doing this, you're starting from scratch. So to answer your question, yes, we know there are certain patterns, but we have to respect the individuality of each person. That's what makes this field so exciting and interesting. There's no, you don't go on autopilot.
Right. Every case is different.
We're people. They're dealing with people.
Wow. So what type of, I know I might have asked this before, but what are certain emotions that people feel like that you see on a daily basis? And these are common, when you say grieve, you would think that anger is something that is common, or...
So yeah, anger is common. What we tend to see is that, first of all, anybody who's learned Kubler-Ross's 5 stages, and it's still being taught in graduate school. And when I was in Jersey City after the shooting, we had a meeting in the City Hall.
Wait, could we just,
Wait,
what those, yeah.
For Yoni, could you tell us the 5 stages?
We have 2 doctors here, I'm the only guy.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, Kubler-Ross was one of the great people who actually took the issue of grief and counseling for grief and made it part of the mainstream mental health interest. It used to be relegated pretty exclusively to the clergy and nursing. And she had 7 stages, one said 5 stages you go through as a response to a death. In fact, if you could use a good laugh, there's a YouTube on Bart Simpson, finds out he's going to die, and in 30 seconds goes through all 5 stages, And the research has shown that each stage is relevant, but people don't follow lockstep in those stages. Now that she herself, she died pretty young. She died in her 50s. She herself retracted that and said, yes, no, you can't reduce human beings to think
What are they?
So there's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, I think, and acceptance. So in fact, the research shows that acceptance is often the first stage. But these are relevant, but they're not, people just don't. And sometimes I've had people come to me and say, I don't know, people say, I read this brochure, I'm supposed to go through these stages, I'm not going through these stages, and they think they're doing something wrong. So that's important. But what we tend to find, and again, my focus, I have to say, is, again, more of these unexpected, horrific deaths. I mean, the particular area I've done most of my work is parental loss of a child, so parents have lost children. And the early grief tends to be a flurry of emotions. Sometimes people describe themselves like getting beaten up. They have anger and jealousy, confusion. There's a host of responses. And as time progresses, it kind of narrows down to what grief is all about, which is that void in your heart, that painful missing the person. Which is why sometimes, again, I get asked, does it make a difference how the person died, how the person grieves? And in early grief, yes, but ultimately, it doesn't matter. What matters is the child, the spouse, the brother, the sister, the parent are not here.
Right.
And that's what it comes down to.
Wow.
Could we talk a little bit about those tragic losses that you've been involved in? And, how does that work? How does that go? Someone calls you to come in?
Okay, so there are many different ways. Sometimes it just happened. So Hatzalah or the rabbi, rarely, or not the immediate family member, but an uncle and aunt will call me. I've learned to make sure my ringer's on at night, because it can happen 2 a.m. Mark once called me, 3 a.m. And you have to mobilize.
Right.
I have to mobilize very quickly. In fact, even in my private practice, when I first meet with a patient, I tell them, there's one thing I have to warn you. I do trauma work. If my phone rings, I'm going to check it. And sometimes I have to pick up, because if I know somebody just lost a spouse in a vehicular accident and they're calling me, I have to pick that up.
Wow.
Usually I pick up and say, I'm in session, can it wait? 9 out of 10 times it can, but just the fact that I picked up makes a difference.
Right.
And usually you don't pick up in a session. So that's, if you don't like it, see someone else. But that's the nature of the work that I do. So we're going to get notified. Sometimes, and this is, I have to say, one of the hardest things I do, although I always think it'll be harder than it really is, I have to do the notification. I'm trained in death notification. So I have to be the one to go down and notify the loved ones. Wow. And that there's ways people have to be trained in that. I train the rabbis the future rabbis at YU how to do death notification, because very often the clergy is the one they call. I once got a call from a rabbi out of town. One of his congregants' children was a lone soldier and took his life, and the embassy called him to notify the family. So it's it's a quick mobilization. That's one way. And then the other way, which is that sometimes I get called in the day after Shiva, or even sometimes a little later. Either somebody else or some other institution did the immediate work, and now there's the grieving process, and grief counseling is very different than therapy. And so then I become, and usually what it means for me or members of my team is we position ourselves in such a way that we're a resource for these families as they go through what's often a multi-year process of grief.
How is it different? You said it was different. How is it different? You said the therapy in general is different than.
Okay. So now you get my lecture. I'll present it to you as I present it to my students. Okay.
Sure, I'd love to hear it.
We have a condition called depression, which is characterized by sadness, morosity, pessimism, crying. We have a condition called grief, which looks very much like depression: sadness, morosity, grief, crying. We have a technique called psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is pretty successful with depression. We have about an 80% cure rate, which is better than the physicians doing with the common cold.
Right.
Where therapy works for depression and other conditions. Yet the research shows that regular psychotherapy for grief is at best harmless and possibly harmful. There's a lot of work done by Niemeyer, University of Memphis. And so the question comes up, and when I'm teaching my rabbinic students, I get the thumb out, So here you have two conditions. They look so much alike.
But
And one, psychotherapy helps, and the other, it's at best harmless. What's the difference?
Great.
Okay, so you want to answer it?
Should I get?
Give a guess.
There's a Yiddish expression. No, I'm not going to say the Yiddish expression. Okay. Yeah.
What would I think? Why would grief?
What's the difference?
Well, first I would have to say I have to understand what psychotherapy is.
Oh, okay.
Right. So I honestly
he's good at bowing out of things.
He's a lawyer.
I don't fully. Isn't psychotherapy when you go back to yourself?
That's
or
one
something?
type. That's one type. Okay. Basically, the difference is when someone's depressed, there's a disconnect between their mood and the reality of their lives.
Okay, say that again. So there's a disconnect.
In other words, they have the regular, normal heartaches and frustrations, but they're more sad than the situation warrants.
Got it. That's
and
depression.
therefore, therapy works to enhance, to increase, if you will, make them happier.
Like more present, and focus on the positives.
Whatever it is, realize the glass is half full and half empty. However you do it.
Got it.
That's another topic. I'll let your other guests talk about that. In grief, not only is the pain legitimate, but it's necessary. So whereas in therapy, I measure my success by therapy for someone who's depressed, I measure my success by how much happier I make the person. In grief, I measure my success by how much I bring out the sadness.
Is that part of religious, Shiva, or the process of?
Yes, to large, and Shiva serves also another function that's relevant to grief. We'll get to that later.
Oh, okay.
But it is, part of it is, and that's, by the way, the most common mistake well-meaning people make when they pay Shiva visits or when they're dealing with the bereaved. Because when we see someone sad, we want to make them happier. We want to relieve them of their pain. And so therefore, some very well-meaning but stupid things are said. And everybody who's grieving, usually, like when I do a retreat, let's say for parents who lost children, the number one topic obviously is the loss of the child. The number two topic is all the well-meaning but stupid things people have said to them. And most of the time it's their attempt to make them happy. To make them, I remember one parent who lost a child says to people when they say to him, your son's in a better place, says, how would you like your son in a better place? It's, these
It's not
things.
helpful. Right?
Huh?
It's not helpful.
Yeah, it's not helpful. And what's really helpful, I will tell you that I've heard this story, a few different versions. I'll mention one version. Someone once told me who lost a 2-year-old and a toddler. Terrible. I don't want to say how, because it would divulge who the person is. But he said the most comforting visit was, the way he put it, was an older man with much life experience, came to the Shiva house, kind of worked his way up. When he he was face to face, he asked to see a picture of this man's daughter who was just killed, looked at the picture, cried for 10 minutes straight, handed the picture back, said the hamakom, and left. He said that was the most comforting visit. That's grief counseling.
Wow.
Not trying to not telling him your son's in a better place, or or you have other children, or the kind of things people sometimes say, which are meant well. That's part of the problem.
Right. Because you're trying to make the person happy.
But it causes more pain than comfort.
Okay. Could you give us just some more examples, just because hopefully a lot of people listen to this, and we could give them some tips in terms of what to say, what not to say?
Well, sometimes it's better what you don't say. There's a rabbi in my community has a very good line. He says, a fish would never get caught if it kept its mouth shut. It's sometimes it's best to keep your mouth shut. And indeed, you're supposed to, according to Jewish law, be quiet until the mourner speaks. Or for that matter, if we have a paradigm in the Bible of, let's say, loss of a child, it's Aaron, whose 2 children were killed amidst a very joyous celebration.
Right.
And Moses offers him some consolation. And then comes 2 very powerful words. It says, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. And some of the commentators mention that the typical word in Hebrew for quiet is shtika. We should say vayishtok. But that vayishtok means you have something to say, but you keep your mouth shut, which is also impressive. Vayidom is that deep, abiding silence when there's nothing to say. And sometimes just being quiet is important. But mourning with the bereaved, just mourning with them. When we were in Surfside, and this wasn't me, this was one of the people I was working with, one of the members of my team, and I think it's great to mention because they're great, also, the whole team. We're walking, and there was the family room. This was 2-3 days after the building collapsed. There was still hope that they'd find someone alive. And, what do we do? What do we say, And she passed an older woman who was crying and praying, saying, Tehillim Etrern, So she didn't go over to her and say, well, you can talk to me, stuff like that. There was a seat next to her, it was empty. She said, can I sit next to you? And she said, yeah. And then she took out Psalms and Tehillim and started praying. She doesn't know how it started, but the woman started talking about her granddaughter who was in the building. And she just listened. And then the woman hugged her and thanked her for being so understanding. And she said afterwards, when we did a debriefing, she said, what did I do? That's grief counseling. You sit down with them and you join them. And sometimes people ask me how I help people on these weekends I do for those, let's say, parents who lost children. And I say, imagine someone carrying a very, very heavy load, very heavy package. So I take my shoulder and I take a corner of it. That's what I do. So that's grief counseling. It's not giving them Torah discourses, but talking to them about how the soul is remigrating and then they're in a better... That's not it. It's listening, validating their pain. And I have this all the time. So many times I feel like a charlatan because I'm just sitting and listening and being sympathetic and being attentive and maybe just asking questions to clarify what they're saying, not offering anything in return. And the people are so grateful afterwards. And I'll say, what did I do? There's a famous study, the Steep Hill study. I'm sure you know the Steep Hill study, right? No, I know you don't. That's okay. Do you ever talk? I mean, so anyway, the Steep Hill study is they took a bunch of college freshmen. We love studying college freshmen because for $10 they'll do anything.
Yeah.
And
or for like class credit, I think that's also why they get a lot of people.
All right, but they gave them a very heavy backpack, and they took them to a steep hill, and they said, we want you to climb this hill. But before you climb it, I want you to estimate how hard it is to climb this hill. And the only difference was one group climbed it alone, and the other one climbed it with a friend. And pretty consistently, the people who climbed it with a friend estimated the hill as less steep than those who climbed it alone. So grief counseling is climbing the hill with the other person.
Okay, so at a
Wow.
Shiva, if a person's in doubt, like better to say nothing.
Well, okay, there's
right?
that. The other thing about Shiva, okay, you get me started, right?
No, I think this is just very practical for people.
Okay, so we practice.
Yeah.
Sure. No, I welcome this because it's an opportunity for others to do things right. One of the other things about death and grief counseling is, and as I often tell people, when someone dies, the relationship doesn't end, it changes.
Oh, interesting.
It changes from a face-to-face relationship to a relationship of memories, of legacies, of stories. And if Shiva is done right, it really, that's the brilliance of Shiva, is that it launches this process. Because when you talk about the person, you're helping the people make this transition from a relationship that was a face-to-face relationship to this relationship of memories. I once heard that someone said, why do we cover mirrors when they're grieving? Because the mirror shows a person when they're here. Now we cover the mirror because now you have to see them when they're not here. And so
Wouldn't you think, though, it's the opposite, though? Like, if you see, like, when you don't want to remember something painful, you just don't look at it. So this relationship you're talking about, it's
an internalized relationship. I know someone, I mentioned one situation, I hope it's not really divulging something, I think. Classic Jewish story, the father built up a business from nothing. I don't know if it was a peddler, but a little something, built up a big business. The son went into the business, and the son was working with the father, and he had the office across the hall from the father's office. And whenever there was a problem, he'd walk into his father's office, and he'd take the seat facing his father, and they would talk it out. His father died very suddenly, relatively young, and this son left his father's office exactly the way it was. And every time he had a problem in business, he would walk into his father's office, he would take the same seat, and he would have an imaginary conversation with his father and figure out the solution to the problem. That's the transition.
wow.
Now, everybody know, I saw your look. Everybody in the office thought he was nuts, but it was his business, so he could do whatever he wants, But but that's what happens. The person, so that's what Shiva allows to occur. So I tell people, first of all, number one, when you're paying a Shiva visit, you don't talk about how the person died. You talk about how the person lived. A 92-year-old dies. He spent 91 years and 50 weeks living and 2 weeks dying. And all people want to talk about, so he had what disease? Why did you go to that hospital? Why didn't you go to the other? That doctor? Oh, he's a murderer. You should have gone to this doctor. Like you can do something about it now, Talk about the person's life. And I often say to people that if you leave the Shiva house knowing more about the person who died than when you came in, even if you didn't say a word, you did nichum avelim, you did consolation. Because now the person's remembered more. Now the person's in somebody. Now I know something. I'll walk into a friend, most of my friends who are sitting Shiva, it's elderly parents. And I'll walk in, people either talking about how he died or talking about, that the Giants finally won a game or something like that. And I'll just say to them, where was your father born? What did they do for a living? Tell me a story about your father. And I walk away and I know something about him. But I've been to Shiva houses sometimes, especially if you're going, let's say it's a very prominent person, the place is packed. I'll walk in, I'll listen for a few minutes, I'll learn something about the person's father, spouse, whatever. I'll walk over and say, the Malcolm on the left, I did nichum avelim. Now I know something about the person. Now the person's becoming a living memory. So when you say what to do in Shiva, learn about the person, internalize that, help the family make this transition from a relationship that's face-to-face to a relationship of memories. And I'll tell you something interesting. I was very blessed. I didn't sit Shiva till I was in my 60s, and my parents lived. And I always knew this, but I always figured to myself, I could also go on the computer and talk about them, write stories about them. What do I need all these guests? And when I sat Shiva, I learned myself that the guests are important. So sometimes people knew things about my parents that I didn't know. But besides that, their reaction taught me about my parents. Because what you live with all your life, you take for granted. So there are certain things I'd mention about my parents that I thought was pretty ordinary, and people were amazed. And I said, oh, that must have been impressive, you know. So that social piece, that interaction, helped me in terms of making that transition, of making my parents a relationship now that I have that's more spiritual, internal, instead of corporal and face-to-face.
Wow.
Okay, could I ask a little bit off-topic question?
Sure.
But this came up with some of my students. We were actually talking about it last night, and I would love to get your opinion
Sure,
on
why
it. They brought up the idea of when people don't tell elderly people about a death in the family. What are your thoughts on that?
You're hitting my, yeah. It's I don't get it. First of all, I want to tell you something very interesting. Having done death notification with elderly people, and I usually make sure Hatzola's around the corner because I'm more,
Right.
they take it very well. Relative, I mean, they're upset. But I find that in many respects, the elderly are more resilient than younger people. They have a lot of life experience. First of all, they're also facing death themselves, so death is not so unfamiliar. But they've been through a lot, you know, and they have a perspective. I remember once notifying about a grandchild who died very suddenly. And he just looked and said, God only takes the diamonds. You know, they handle it very well. I mean, they're in appropriate pain. But, you know, we don't have to treat them like imbeciles, that we have to insulate them. They're very strong people, and they have incredible life experience. Plus, we live in a time, this is very important for the elderly and for children too. We live in the age of information, live in the age of technology. There's no more such a thing anymore as secrets. We're telling, everybody finds out everything. This was, by the way, the most common question I got asked after the Yoni Klestzick murder. I would have to say every tragedy had its themes, you know. And after the Yoni Klestzick murder, the question I got asked most commonly was, okay, Dr. Blumenthal, I understand I have to tell my children, because he was missing, if you remember, and all that.
Yep.
And I was in Borough Park the night before. I was with the fam, but I saw the scene of everybody running around with flashlights, screaming, Libby, it was climbing up train embankments. It was a real, you know, it was a real Kiddush Hashem. It was a real beautiful sight. But so I understand I have to tell my children that he was murdered. I don't even have to understand that. I have to tell my children that the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator at the time, was a member of our community. Do I have to tell my children that he was dismembered? It's so gross. It's so terrible. Can I spare them that information? So I created I made up a mythical figure. I called him the big stupid kid on the bus. I tell them that every bus has one. It's part of your tuition. You pay for a bus, a driver, and a big stupid kid. You know, every bus has one. I raised two of them. I know them very well. You know, the big stupid kid on the bus who goes around telling everybody everything. If he's going to find out, do you want him to find out from you, or do you want him to find out from the big stupid kid on the bus? And that's the world we live in today. The kids find out everything, and the elderly find out everything. And better, you should notify them let you as the adult, responsible adult, professional, notify them than they're finding it out inadvertently. There's another thing that's also very important. It's their heartache. It's their loss. How dare you?
Saying they have the right.
What right do you have to withhold that information? When we do death notification, we try to get there as quickly as possible. If they know I knew about their loved one being dead for 2 hours and I didn't tell them, what right do I have to? And they're offended. It's their child, grandchild, sibling. You have no right to withhold that information. And I've been in many situations where people were withholding information.
Argument.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
I had people like screaming at me the other way.
What's the argument?
We had a big
the other way?
debate. Oh, we should protect them. They only have a year left
Also,
anyway.
there was a time when we did insulate things from young people and older people. That was the culture. They didn't live in a time where you could click a mouse and find out everything. So in those times, maybe it made sense not to tell. In those times, there used to be that umbrella of naivete in childhood where you just didn't find out things. That's out the window in today's world. In today's world of technology, of social media, because they find out. I've had situations where people have not been told, and they find out through social media. It's not the way to find out.
Right. That's right. You're making a trauma even more traumatic by doing it that
so
way.
We notify bluntly, clearly, not cruelly, but bluntly, clearly, and as quickly as possible.
Okay. Could we get some tips in terms of kids? So parents who are listening, and
Right.
there's some, tragedy in the news that the kids are going to hear about, whether they're you talking about it or you're in school or whatever. What are some tips in terms of how to say these horrific things to kids?
So, okay, first I have to understand developmentally how children process information. So, and certainly I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the work by Piaget in terms of awareness of death. And
Yes, of course.
of course, I know you did. Yeah, right. You actually wrote some of the articles on it.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
Peer review,
I-
peer
I-
review.
I appreciate it. Okay, I'm sending a lot of people to you, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Okay, but the until age about 6, we're going to say, because just make it simpler, children don't understand death. They don't understand the permanence. They don't understand the deterioration of the body. One of my favorite stories was a 4-year-old whose father died, and about 6 weeks after his death, he came to his mother and said, "So when's Daddy going to stop dying?" They just don't get it. So their reaction sometimes is very unexpected. And they're usually not grief-stricken because they don't understand it, but they also are little people in a big confusing world, so they're scared. So the typical reaction of a kid may be something like, "Okay, so who's going to make me my lunch today?" Or something like that. We do, we'll notify them because they need to know, and they sense something big has happened. But they're not going to understand death. In fact, sometimes what happens is that when they hit around age 6, they understand death, and they start grieving then.
I was going to ask, how to, is there a time where it just clicks in?
Yeah, it clicks in because they get it. So you'll have someone who lost, let's say, a parent age 4, and they're going along their merry way, and sometime around 6, they're a mess because, wait a minute, this is forever.
Right. And they see what
Oh,
they're
this is
missing
all
now. Right? They realize
this
what they're
he's
missing.
not coming back. So then you also grieve differently as a teenager, so they'll process it differently then. But for the most part, we tell them very clearly, and we use the word died. We don't use euphemisms because their brain is, even with adults, it has to be very clear. And we assure them of their continued protection. Let's say especially if it's a parent, that they're going to have a roof over their head, they're going to be fed, etc. What I do have to, again, I'm going on a tangent maybe. What elementary school age children typically do, which is very classic for elementary school age children, is when they hear shocking news, they withdraw. They classic response will be, "Okay, can I go to my room and play now?" And then they'll come back, usually at the single most inconvenient time. I always say that about kids. It's Friday afternoon, you haven't put the children up yet, the house is flying, and you don't know if you're going to be ready for Shabbos. That's when your 8-year-old comes and asks you where babies come from. They just have a knack for picking the absolutely worst time to ask questions. But they'll come back with questions, and that's classic for kids that age. They're also usually interested in facts. That's an age of being interested in facts. They're not busy trying, sometimes parents, adults sometimes, especially if it's, again, these, 8-year-olds that die, or a young mother who dies, or something like that, terrorist attack. We as adults struggle with what's called in philosophy theodicy, why bad things happen to good people. Tzadik v'elo rasha v'tov lo. So and I've had situations where I'll go to a school after, let's say, a classmate dies. And the kids will raise their hands. "My father told me that he was a Gilgal from the previous generation," and they have no idea what they're talking about. This is the parents who are struggling with this. Kids this age aren't struggling with that. They're not trying to figure God out. They know God's pretty powerful and they'll do what he wants, but they're not struggling with understanding God. That can happen in adolescence. Adolescence will deal with the injustice, with the wrongs, etc. Adolescents also develop, I'm giving you what I probably do is spend 3 hours teaching in a course in 3 minutes, but adolescents also have a capacity for empathy, which is different than sympathy. Younger children can sympathize. They know something terrible happened to another person. They're not capable yet of putting themselves in that person's place. the adolescent is capable of doing that. So and any new skill you have, you overplay. So the adolescents will typically, that's maybe more the classmates or friends, will imagine themselves that person. And a classic thing that'll happen to me, particularly if I go to a girls' school, is, I'll come in and I get, we want them to be emotional and share their emotions. So they're crying and they're weeping, and I go off feeling very good. And a week later, the principal calls me and said, Dr. Muller, you did a great job. They're crying, they're weeping, they're mourning. We haven't gotten a stitch of work done. How can you get them to stop mourning, And you have to come back and sort of turn off the faucet. So those are, again, very
And that's
brief.
because they're empathizing.
They're
you said.
capable of putting themselves in the other person's place,
right.
which a pre-adolescent doesn't do.
And okay. Mm-hmm. And do you find yourself dealing with a lot of these existential questions in these?
Sure. As teenagers?
How do you deal with these questions?
Well, sometimes I like to punt to the rabbi, but I can come even in grief counseling, some of the more longer grief counseling. So, sometimes I'll discuss it, but I assure them that by the time we're done, the question will be better than the answer. Sometimes I quote the famous Kutzker Rebbe, who said, I could never believe in a God I could understand. God, by definition, has to be mysterious, has to be beyond their comprehension, or he's not God. So, we'll talk about different approaches and different ways of looking at things. For example, the psychological research shows, and I'm purposely using the English words because it's based on psychological research, that people who believe in a soul and a hereafter and the resurrection of the dead fare better with grief than those who don't. And it's an interesting thing about grief counseling is, so if I see, let's say, a fellow Orthodox Jew, I pretty much know their belief system. But if I see an unaffiliated Jew or a Gentile, which I have, in grief counseling, and if I do my regular therapy, whatever their beliefs are, that really has nothing to do with the work I do. But in grief counseling, I need to know whether they believe in these things. Do you believe in a soul? Do you believe in heaven? Do you believe that the person's watching you, is still communicating, interested in you? And
that makes a difference.
Because that's part of the work.
Really?
Are you going to have a conversation with a person? Are you going to, like this man who went to his father's office? So I need to know that. And I'll ask them. That's part of the work. So I got on a tangent. So these get the questions so we'll discuss the idea of why God did this, what is the purpose of function, how I understand, how can I fit it in with my beliefs, and I'll discuss it with you. But if you want answers, there are no answers.
Right. Okay, so just back to grief counseling for a minute. Should everyone who experiences a loss go for grief counseling?
No.
Okay.
Really?
There are those. I want you to know, again, I mentioned I've
And the same answer would be for trauma as well? You would say the same answer?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
How would someone know? Like, how would someone know?
They know. You have to understand something. This is, again, a common misnomer, and I want to correct this. People think that when someone has suffered a loss or a trauma, they become stupid. And it's true in some respect. In other words, if you just had a horrible event happen to you, you're not going to remember Tante Yente's new recipe for Lakshmankugel. It's not going to be on, you'll have forgotten that. Or you might forget the exact value of pi. You're not going to. But what's relevant to your grieving or your recovery, the person themselves are brilliant. And to go back to what I mentioned earlier, people know what they need. I call it the psychological adrenaline rush. Like if you're in danger, suddenly all the blood runs to your extremities and you can run fast and pick up cars and climb trees. And same thing happens psychologically. When you're traumatized or you're facing terrible loss, all your focus and energy goes to that situation. So you know what you need to do. And it's very important to respect, unless the person, let's say, the two exceptions would be if somebody had a pre-existing mental illness. So then, of course, they can't trust their thinking about anything. I'm talking about a severe mental illness. Or if the person's bowing to pressure, is trying to respond the way people tell them they should. But if the person's being spontaneous and natural, they know what they need. And I've had people, I've had people call up and say, I told him he has to come see you. I told him, and he says, no, he doesn't want to talk to anybody. He wants to. for that person, that's right.
Interesting.
And you have to respect it. They know what they need. And grief is a journey. They may not want it now. And then sometimes these very same people who, would sooner, have a root canal without anesthesia than talk to me, 2 years later, call me up, so I'm ready. So it's
Depends.
some people don't want to be at the retreats because they'll find hearing other people's stories get them even more upset. And then others say, I'm feeling validated. Fine. It's the only weekend I feel normal.
Wow.
So everybody's different, and you got to respect that.
How did those retreats? How you came up with that idea? Where did that come? Where did that idea come from? Where did that come? Where did that start? You started. I'm assuming you started it.
Started what idea?
The retreats.
So the retreats. There were a few different retreats I've done. It wasn't originally my idea. No, it was the idea of some organizations. I was invited to come and do them. So that wasn't my idea. But the notion of, David Pelkov likes to point out in Hebrew, Ashrei means happy. Ashrei Secha. Ishur means confirmation, validation. Validating is a source of happiness. And sometimes being in a group with others who have similar situations, people have a feel for one another if they've been through the same situation. I had an incredible thing happen not so long ago. I was interviewing someone for a job in an organization I'm involved with. I was coming as a psychologist, and a friend of mine who's a very successful businessman and, the lay leader, the money guy. We're interviewing this young man for a position. In the middle of the interview, this guy who's interviewing with me turns to the fellow and says, "Did you lose a parent at a young age?" And the guy said, "Yeah, my father died when I was 9. And he said, "Yeah, my father died when I was 11. And I'm looking at him. I'm the psychologist. I'm supposed to know this, and after I said, "How did you know?" He says, "I can't put it in words, but I know when I meet someone if they also lost a parent at a young age."
Wow.
Now, that's what happens at a retreat, at a group. There's an understanding that's more than I can comprehend. But some people, it's contraindicated. You have to listen, and that's so important. And that's not just for the mental health professionals, but for the family members and the friends. They know what they need. Listen to them. Don't give them, advice, and don't tell them how they're going to get over it. I hate that term. Listen to them. That's all. Like that woman did in Surfside. Just sit next to her and say to hell I'm with her. That's all. That's grief counseling. Climbing the hill with someone else. Now, this is why I don't get invited to parties, right? This is why I have no friends.
No, it's really very, very important stuff. How does I'm not a psychologist clearly, but you said something earlier that made me think throughout this conversation. Like how do humans, like, how do we not come to terms with death like early on? Like it's like 100% going to happen, but somehow we like don't embrace it we kind of like, how does that work? I was thinking about this prior to when we'd have this conversation, but once you brought it up, it made me think like, well, how does that work?
Okay. So I'll tell you a study that was done. You probably know it, but it was done about 20 some years ago. Psychologists woke up one day and said, for years we've been studying why people are depressed. Let's study why people are happy. Now, they couldn't just call it happiness because it doesn't sound scientific, so they called it SWB, subjective well-being. Happiness. And did this huge international study of what makes people, what differentiates people who are happy. And they came up with the 3 Fs. Want to take a stab at it?
Friends.
Friends, good.
Oh, family.
There you go. Nobody gets the 3rd one, don't worry.
Hold on. Friends, family, and fun.
No.
That was a close one.
All right, so you got a 66, There's always summer school. Don't worry about it, Okay. Faith. Now, how did they measure faith? How do you measure what someone's feeling? They measure it by membership in a house of worship. So if you have close family ties, good friends, and you have a communal affiliation, you belong to a house of worship, a synagogue, church, mosque, whatever, you're a happy person. So as we used to say in Shiva in Latin, what's the tzara shava b'neihem? What's the common denominator? What do all 3 have in common?
They begin with the letter F.
Social support.
Connections,
Yeah.
people. What's important in life is people. That's what brings us happiness, is connections, people. And when one of them is taken away from us, there's going to be it's a big void. People talk about the loss as if a limb was cut off. It's what keeps us going are these connections. And therefore that even though we may know about death, and it's important to teach children, there's a lot of interest. In fact, there's one study. They took children, three sets of three different types of children. One who never experienced any kind of death, one who experienced immediate death in their family, and one that experienced the death of a pet. And who understood death the best of all of them? And it was the pet.
Interesting.
Which is why on Purim we give kids these goldfish that die 2 days later, because, and the reason is they're exposed to death, but it's not so close that they're going to have, today we are very attached to pets, so maybe it's, let's exclude dogs and cats, people get very, but let's say it's a fish, which you don't get so attached to. They have an exposure to death, but it's not such an immediate attachment that they can discuss it and process it, and even the sadness, and get a familiarity with it. So it is important and we shouldn't shield children. I mean, many people talk about the fact that we farm people out to nursing homes and hospitals. They don't experience the death in the home. Now we're doing it more, but as people used to in the olden days. But still, it still hurts because that's what life's about. And then we have that job of making that transition to making it an internalized relationship. So it's not a total separation. The person
Right.
still. One of the things I'll do in groups that I run is I have 3 basic rules. All I've touched upon already. One is if you have a way of coping, share it, but don't try to impose it on others, because what's an elixir for one person is toxic for the other. That's one. Second of all, let's say if I'm dealing with bereaved parents, say your child's name. If someone says my son, I'll say, you mean Mark? Something like that. Or my daughter, you mean Ellen. And when applicable, talk in the present tense. Mark was loving? No, Mark is loving. Mark was very attached to me. Mark is very attached to you. And I'll correct them.
Because, why?
Because it's a current relationship.
Current relationship.
It's a different relationship, but it's a current relationship.
Interesting.
And that's the transition that takes place during grief.
Wow.
Wow.
Does it ever get too far where a person doesn't recognize that this sounds like this can get creative, but it can
no, if you're doing seances and I often say it used to be just a Hasidic thing to do, and now other people do is that if you go to this Jewish cemetery, you'll see invitations. Used to be, you drop off an invitation. I always say the problem is when you get an RSVP. That's when I get worried, but if you're going to do seances or you're going to, or something like that, these are exceptions. People naturally, even without a grief counselor, they go through the grieving process. What I'm doing is just laying out the map for them, really. They're grieving. So you have exceptions. Yes, you'll have people that will talk as if the person's still next to them when it's 3 years later. And I don't mean in a spiritual sense. I mean in a physical sense. It is not uncommon in very early grief to literally forget that the person died. That happens in the first week or two sometimes, where you pick up the phone to call them, you go to the room to wake them up, things like that.
Wow.
But that's very, very early. But for the most part, no, it becomes that relationship. It becomes, some people, for example, it's become an increasing custom. Let's say if there's a wedding or a bar mitzvah and there's a family picture, so they bring the portrait of the person who's not here. And they put it in the picture because they're there. Now I don't know if they cut and paste and put them, but they come with a portrait. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. We're talking about grieving, and this is with other human beings. But I know this may sound strange, but is there ever a grieving process for a non-human entity, like a business
Yeah.
or?
It's like this. Yeah. Or you move out of your neighborhood you grew up in.
Okay.
Parents sell the house you grew up in. Do you grieve that house? Right? Do when someone gets divorced, do you grieve the marriage that you wished you had?
Right.
So
Is that depression? Or
so
is that
I like to look at it as overlapping circles. I don't think it's identical as grieving a death. There's some overlap. There is that pining for it, that missing it, and there is that internalization. So, the house I grew up in Queens is part of me. I haven't been there in years, but it's part of my memories. It's part of what shaped me. So there is an overlap, but I don't like it when people make it like it's identical. When talk about grief counseling because your business didn't work out now and you have to foreclose or whatever, there is a grieving process. Yes. Yeah. We form attachments to things. We form attachment to neighborhoods, to dreams and hopes. So yeah, there is that loss, but it's different. So as I said, I like to look at it as two overlapping circles.
Do you ever deal with people who had I'm not sure how, I'm sure you've been doing this for a very long time, that had to experience, let's say, the Holocaust or
No, I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor.
Okay.
So how do you think I got into this?
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah. And my dissertation was on children of Holocaust survivors. So
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Okay, so I should definitely read that.
yeah. I'm full of cheer and joy. It's like
So how was that? How would a person? I'm saying, can you share your experience with if a patient was like, is it different or is the same rubric, different rubric?
You're talking about someone who survived the Holocaust?
Or some just grief, traumatic experience.
Someone
is
who's
it much?
of past trauma, is the grief going to be different? Is that the question?
I think so. I mean, if it's
Like someone who had past losses or past traumas.
right, meaning it's
and-
extremely intense, and it's been a long time since maybe that person has opened up.
My mother died at 91. She was liberated at 21. She died a Holocaust survivor. Those things don't leave you. You carry it with you. It's not the same. It's processed and reprocessed and reprocessed.
Right. I guess I was trying to ask like what like if you had to have a patient and it was the process different or was the same? Because
if the patient was a survivor
correct.
the losses and the trauma of the Holocaust
or any
was huge, was beyond. I mean, it's not, let's backtrack, okay?
Yeah, please.
We're very stuck. That's why I don't like this term, get over it, okay? We're very caught up in this healing paradigm, right? So you have a sore throat. You go to the doctor, he says you have strep. He gives you antibiotics, it goes away. You're healed, right? You have a fracture, you go to the orthopedist, he puts a cast on, the bone mends, you're healed. That doesn't happen with the death of a 4-year-old. That doesn't happen with being widowed at age 32. That doesn't happen losing a sibling in a vehicular accident. That doesn't happen from a Holocaust. You don't get over it. You don't heal. What happens is you gain mastery over it, but you take it with you. It gets integrated into who you are. So, someone, a lot of people that say, again, who lost children will describe to me that they're sitting Shiva, and an elderly couple shows up, and they'll say, yeah, I lost that child 30 years ago. And they cry together. Now, are they in the same place in grief? No. But they don't just get over it. It's like nothing happened. But what happens during the grieving process, and we find, for example, that the grieving process for a child is a roughly 5-year process. it's a 5-year event, and then I can explain what consolation is ultimately. But I remember actually just recently I was speaking to someone who lost a child under, again, very extreme, tragic circumstances, and she said it in an interesting way. She said, my pain has gone from an acute pain to remembered pain, but it's still painful. Someone else once described that she was trying to talk to someone who was more recently bereaved, and she was trying to describe what it's like now years later. And she said, now I carry my grief around me in a package around my neck. And when I need it, I reach in and I take it. But she's still carrying it around with her. That's true of many big life experiences. We don't get over it. We integrate it into who we are. We become, in fact, again, I probably should have alluded to that earlier when I mentioned how the pain is necessary in grief. You're going to ask why. Why did God make us that we have to be in pain? God could have made us that people die and we just go on with our lives like nothing happened. Why? What's the point of the pain? And my understanding is, the way I look at it, is that grief is a growth process. We change. And we change through pain. That's human nature. No better proof. The one day in our year which is most associated with growth, which is Yom Kippur, we do Inu Nefesh. We put ourselves in pain. So the pain induces growth. In fact, someone just showed me recently an interesting cartoon. He said, let me try to remember what it looked like. It showed like a black ball in a jar. He said, some people think you get over grief, and it shows the black ball getting smaller and smaller. And then it says that's not what happens, is you get bigger and bigger. So the black ball remained the same, but the jar got bigger and bigger. And that's what happens. You grow so that you can manage and tolerate and work this tragedy into who you are. So you don't get over it. You're still grieving. And I've dealt with people who've lost. I remember my wife befriended a woman, a Holocaust survivor. Talk about tragedy. She had a 2-year-old infant who the Nazis used as target practice, was deported to Auschwitz, where Mengele did experiments on her, and she could never have any more children. And my wife met her in a park or something like that, and stayed would meet with her. And I didn't meet her, and we finally made a simcha, and she was invited. Made a bar mitzvah, and she was invited. And I suddenly see this older woman coming up to me, and she says, "Hi, I'm going to change the name. I'm Mrs. Goldstein, and in 3 weeks is my son's 62nd yahrzeit." What do you say to that? Oh, well, what about the Mets? What do you say? But that's how that was her identity. In 3 weeks is my son's 62nd yahrzeit. She was living.
Right.
She went through life, she couldn't have any more children, but she had nieces, nephews, she was close. So you don't get over it. You master it. You integrate it into who you are. It shapes, during all those years you're grieving it, you recreate your world. And that's true of many of these big events. I know cancer survivors who passed that critical point, and now the likelihood of their getting cancer is the same percentage as anyone else. But I tell them, on your 120th birthday, you're going to be a cancer survivor. That's what happens. And that's what people have to understand.
Could we go back to that 5-year timeline that you were talking about?
Right. What happens during those 5 years?
Like how does that work?
Okay. So what happens is, what I tell people is, first of all, I tell them, especially let's say if I'm at the very early stage, I'm telling people, how am I going to live? You're going to survive. You're going to live. I can tell. I haven't seen enough cases. It's going to be extremely painful. I don't sugarcoat it. It's going to be heart-wrenching and painful. First of all, one of the things we say is grief isn't linear. And logic would say it's the worst. When it first happens, it gets better and better. It gets better, it gets worse, it gets better, and it gets worse. Also, and that alludes to what I mentioned earlier in terms of how important people are. A person doesn't have just one role. the people we love, our family members, have multiple places in our landscape and in our world. And we have to, it's like untying a Gordian knot. You have to unravel each piece. So you sort of visit different pieces of who this person is to you as you go through the grieving process. So, that's why people will say, I had a good 2 months and I had a terrible. Sometimes it's for obvious reasons. One of the things we talk about, especially when children die, is that you don't just, when an elderly person dies, a 92-year-old dies, you grieve the life they had. When a young person dies, you grieve the future. You grieve the life you wish they had. You grieve your dreams. So every milestone that the peers pass is a knife in your heart. I got a call from a woman who lost a 6-year-old, and it was 6-7 years later. I hadn't really heard from her in quite a while. She called me up sobbing and crying. I was like, oh, what happened? She passed one of her daughter's friends, and she was reading a regular book. And the last book her daughter read was a picture book. And just that brought back the grief. Because her daughter didn't read regular narrative books. So the grieving, those 5 years are, to some extent, rewriting, recreating your world. It's a different world. It's a world based on the presence or now absence of that person, which is a life, a whole complicated part of their world. The other thing is also making that transition to the new relationship, to the spiritual, internalized relationship. That's work, and that's painful work. And then I'll tell you something which probably is, to me, one of the most fascinating parts of all this work. Sometimes around that 5-year juncture, especially again with parents who've lost children, I'll get a phone call from a parent and they'll say to me, Dr. Blumenthal, I miss the pain. I want the pain back. I could write a book about that. Not that I'm ever writing a book. I don't have, again, there's not enough Ritalin to get me to sit and write a book. But the pain becomes so essential to the grieving that they feel guilty, first of all, feeling less pained, but they miss the pain.
Miss the pain. Miss the pain.
They miss the pain. They want the pain back.
Why?
Because first of all, okay, let's say, what human experience could capture the attachment between a parent and a child, a mother to a child? It's so deep. It's so intense. The closest approximation is pain, because pain is piercing. So it captures the connection. And when it feels less painful, they feel like they're losing that connection.
Wow.
So they want the pain back. And that, to me, is like...
So do they find other ways to connect?
Right, but not as intensely.
Like, not as painful.
Right. In other words, nechama, it was called in Hebrew, or consolation, is not getting over it, is not healing. But what happens is, I'll tell you a story. I was once on an intervention in another city. And it was a very traumatic one. It was something that happened in full view of a whole bunch of people. It was a pedestrian accident. And little children witnessed it, and kids who had this person as a camp. I mean, it was trauma, grief, everything mixed together. And while I was there, as if the job wasn't hard enough, I was interviewed by one of these Jewish radio personalities, I don't know. And he's asking me more about the trauma. At one point he says to me, Dr. Blumenthal, what about the family of this young man? Will they ever get over it? And I said something, I couldn't believe I said it. Like it was one of those, they must have been God talking, I said, the grief will be forever, but the pain will be less. To understand what happens in grief, you have to differentiate between the grief and the pain. Someone who loses, especially a child, but anyone, loses even a parent, even an elderly parent, I miss my parents, you grieve them forever. They have a place in your life, in your world, that's now empty to some extent. So you're grieving forever. But what happens is, through this growing process of grief, it becomes, I sometimes put it like this to parents, I say, the unbearable becomes just bearable. It becomes less painful. That's the difference. That's what consolation is not grieving less, not missing the person less, but not hurting as much. But people miss that pain. They regret losing that pain. And my answer to them, by the way, is you can either have nechama or the pain. You can't have both. And,
Interesting. Can I ask something personal?
Yeah.
It's a very heavy
Yeah.
topic, and you're dealing with this, on a daily basis. What do you do to stay just so happy
Shall I show
and
you
making
the,
jokes? And
I'm sorry, the needle mark. So it's a very good question. And by the way, you're touching on a whole other topic, which I could talk about for another 2 hours. And how long have I been talking? Okay. Oh my God. It's called secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. Sometimes called compassion fatigue. I don't like that term because I don't think you get fatigued from being compassionate. But if debriefing is very important, it's a requirement on my team. If somebody goes on an intervention or after, let's say, Surfside or after Pittsburgh, we got to meet afterwards and process it. Otherwise, people get burned out and, they can't. So you have to process it. That's absolutely the case. I personally, the interesting thing about secondary trauma is the research shows that those most vulnerable are the people in sort of the middle of their career. Because early people didn't have enough traumatic events for it to catch up with them. More senior people already have coping mechanisms, so it's the guys in the middle sort of who are most vulnerable. But I do have to process it, and I process it with team members, sometimes with my wife, Nebuch. I do have to sometimes with rabbis and just need to talk it out. I also go hiking. About once a month, I have a fake organization called ACE, which stands for Arthritic Country Hiking Expeditions, a bunch of old guys like me. We spend a day in the woods, and we go hiking. And there's something about nature that for me is therapeutic and essential. And there's something about the perfection of ecology and how nature and there's just, I don't know, I can't put it in words, but that's how I cope.
Wow.
Okay.
it's a lot. It's a lot.
It's really unbelievable to be able to speak with you on this
I feel
topic.
very privileged. I do feel very privileged.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound boastful, but there are people who say that. I think I'll give you an example. And again, this is maybe encourage people to do this kind of work. A few years ago, again, there was a tragedy in another city. They used to joke with me in the organization. They used to say that my slogan is "You die, I fly." It's because I'm going out to different places.
Oh, gosh.
It's terrible. Yeah, I know. It's bereavement humor. Okay. But I went out of town, and I was speaking to community again. A young person died. And they had me in this very large, it was in a school, this very large lunchroom kind of thing, whatever, but closed off with partitions, but not all the way up, so you could hear. And there was a family that lived there that a number of years ago I had assisted also with the loss of a child. And they came a little late. Babysitting things, whatever, they came a little late. And afterwards they came up to say hello. We hadn't seen each other in a while. And the wife said to me that as soon as she walked into the room and heard my voice, she felt comfort. She felt calmed. That's flattering. That's an incredible place to be. And I've had similar things. I mean, I've also blown them, but no, you don't talk about that on podcasts. But it's a very special. I consider myself very blessed, and it was the last thing in the world I thought I'd do in graduate school. I have, man plans, God laughs. But I do consider myself very blessed to have somehow have a knack for this, and to be able to have helped people at their worst moments, to be the person who was there for them, is a very, very special privilege.
Yeah,
Very, very,
unbelievable.
very special privilege, and so I do consider myself very blessed. That's a good place to end, okay?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much
Okay,
for
my
coming.
pleasure.
Here.
All right.
Whew, what an episode. If you enjoyed that, please subscribe, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or you're watching this on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, go ahead and rate us 5 stars, please, and let us know what your favorite part of the episode is. And if you're watching this on YouTube, get down in that comment section and let us know your thoughts on this episode. Maybe there's something we missed. Maybe we should have Dr. Norman back and ask him a few questions that we couldn't cover. It's just been really good. And get ready. We have so many different challenges and issues that we want to talk about. And we have a bunch more recorded. We're recording more. Some are more specific and niche, but they're so important for everyone to hear. And then we have more general conversations and challenges in our community, whether it be about raising children and chinuch, or about just being in relationships, or being married, marital relationship and marital advice. That should be fun to talk about. So until next time, stay safe. If you or a loved one needs any help, guidance from a therapist, psychologist, and you're not sure who's right fit for you, you could get the help from Relief, a free organization that you call up and they pair you with who makes sense for you. It's confidential and they're incredible, and they help us source the right psychologist, therapist to speak about any of the issues that we're handling. So you can send them an email. It's info@reliefhelp.org, or you could give them a phone call, 718-431-9501, and the links are in the show notes. Living L'chaim.